Chapter 4. Labor Forth. How Hercules destroyed a great boar. Hercules, in putting down war, so far put down murder. But murder is multiform, not to talk of murdering Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth, are murdering characters in another sense of the tyrann, which being metaphorical murders, break no bones, there are, or rather there were. Anteriorly to this happy era, several varieties of downright, literal, deadly murder. Men, women, and children were worked to death in mines and factories. Wretches were starved in prisons, and the public was poisoned, as will presently be shown, by the wholesale. The old world was infested with certain evils called diseases. We know, though of course no one ever thinks of trying the experiment, what would happen to one of us who should think proper to put his hand in the fire. For we read, in a certain book intended for the instruction of children, that, ignis, fire, urit, burns. But, fortunately, we are also further aware that some things are good to eat and others not, and of those which are good, that it is right to take only a limited quantity. Otherwise that certain consequences, not essentially in any way differing from the burning of one's fingers, must, of necessity, ensue. So that no individual now dreams of eating turtle, venison, beef, mutton, and vegetables for 6, or drinking champagne, port, sherry, or brandy and water for 10. As, sooth to say, was commonly done in times of yore. Nor does anybody otherwise break the laws of health, consequently nobody is ill. Diseases were susceptible of relief, and those whose business it was to afford it were called physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries. The ruins of the hall of the latter, and of the colleges of the two former, were still standing within the memory of man. The practice of these men consisted, that is to say, it ought to have consisted, in directing their patients what to eat and drink, and how to live, and withal in giving and applying to them peculiar substances called medicines and remedies. This latter part of their business was the least and most insignificant portion of it, but our ancestors, with all respect to their memory, were such boobies as to suppose it the principal. They fancied that every disease had an appropriate cure in the shape of some drug or other, which when they became ill, they had nothing to do but to drink, swallow, or use. This mistake of theirs gave origin to another class of practitioners. The physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries lived by the exercise of their calling, that is to say, they were paid, sometimes, by the persons whom they attended. They were obliged to be at much expense and trouble in educating and qualifying themselves for their duties. Whereas the other class was under no obligation of the sort. Its members had only to invent some substance or compound, and to pay a certain sum which secured the monopoly of it to themselves, in order to go and sell it wherever, and to what amount, they pleased. These persons were denominated quacks. Our revered ancestors were distinguished by remark, able faculty, a singular width of swallow. This will perhaps have been inferred from what has been said above of their voracity, but the swallow here intended was a mental or moral swallow, a capacity of gulping assertions of this. The quacks took great advantage. A lie is now a moral monster, a thing we never hear, we only know what it is from history. In the days, however, whereof we write, lies were, as plenty as blackberries, or rather, to use what in this delightful age is an after simile, as abundant as pineapples. Well, these quacks did lie enormously. You could not take up a newspaper or magazine that was not crammed with their falsehoods. Hardly could you pass a wall which did not display them, hardly run your nose against a post without their offending it. They stared you brazenly in the face in the broad ways, they sneaked into your notice in every corner. One quack professed by his infallible specific to cure all diseases, another modestly restricted its efficacy, which, however, he vowed was unerring, to one. Each pressed Styleses and Noakses, in attestation of his therapeutic miracles, into his service by scores, and at last it became a well-known fact that whoever could afford to pay sufficiently for the effectual dissemination of his lies was sure to be repaid for his outlay by the realization of a fortune. For our good progenitors gorged these bounces with avidity, to the infinite detriment and dissatisfaction of the regular professors of physic, and moreover, to the slaughter of whole multitudes, which constituted the species of murder above adverted to. Accordingly, the medical men went to Hercules, to complain to him of the ravages of quackery, which they represented as a terrible bore. Hercules, recollecting his former adventure with the Erymanthian boar, was inquiring about the length of the monster's tusks, when they undeceived him by informing him that they meant a grievance. Whereupon, the hero read them a short but interesting lecture, which he recommended their head man to retail at the next conversazione at the College of Physicians. He expounded unto them the real nature of disease, with the proper principles of treating it, which they pretending that they knew already. The hero asked them why, and be blistered to them. They had kept the people in ignorance. They had allowed the public to remain fools, and how could they complain if it became the prey of knavery? Until they purged their own body of quackery, he would see himself at Erebus before he would stir his stumps, or his club either, to afford them the slightest assistance. With this, he frowned, and shook his said club at them in so threatening and awful a manner that they all went down upon their knees and humbly promised to mind what he had told them, after which, they slunk out of his presence much sadder and wiser men than they were when they came into it. In due time, Hercules set to work to extirpate the evil. His first proceeding was to belabor soundly with his club the unprincipled legislature of the country, which for a consideration protected the quack in the monopoly of his poisonous rubbish. He also distributed an adequate amount of drubbing among the public generally, insomuch that in spite of the density of their skulls he quickly caused the light of reason to dance before their eyes, even as, when a heavy single stick alighteth on the crown of a rustic, sparks and balls as of fire do glimmer and flash athwart his retina. And herein he was no respecter of persons, but did as vigorously and unsparingly assault divers lords spiritual and temporal, county members of parliament, worshipful aldermen, and respectable burgesses, as the most humble workmen and mechanics. Nay, as the latter, many of them, had been better taught at their various institutes than to put faith in quacks, he found even more thumping required at his hands among what were then called the superior classes of society. Indeed, some of those who wanted the hardest hitting, were certain ladies of quality, including a large proportion of superannuated countesses, who had been stupid enough to allow their names to be appended to certificates recommendatory of the ear trumpet of this quack, the spectacles of that, and the eye snuff or stomach pills of the other. Nor did Hercules forget the proprietors of various noted journals, who let out the columns of their papers for quacks to publish their lies in them, but in truth, he dressed and curried them soundly, till they ceased to be the abettors of homicidal humbug. The specific of the quack now rapidly became a drug in the market. Whole warehouses were filled with elixirs, carminatives, electuaries, balsams, and real blessings to mothers, large quantities of which were shot on waste lands as rubbish, while some were converted to agricultural purposes. It was found, however, that the vegetable pills and syrups which, it had been hoped, would form useful manure, proved, in consequence of not being vegetable matter at all, extremely detrimental to the soil. However, certain tons of powders, which were principally composed of bone dust, were used with great benefit in some districts. In fine, the occupation of the quack, thanks to the club of Hercules, was very soon gone, and the only inconvenience which resulted was a certain increase of population. It was remedied by emigration to Australia. As Hercules, when he went to destroy the Erymanthian boar, destroyed likewise the centaurs, so, in putting down the boar of quackery, he overthrew a sect or gang of persons of whom the said centaurs were in some measure typical. For we are informed that the centaurs were a species of monsters, half men and half horse. Now the persons alluded to were a sort of quacks, half rational creatures and half jackass, of whom some were termed homeopathists, others hydropathists, while there likewise belonged unto them several of the mesmerists and phrenologists. All were comprehensible under the generic term pseudosopher. One remarkable circumstance attendant on the destruction of quackery, was an extreme attenuation of the faculty, which included within itself a very large number of virtual quacks. But, however, as a great and corresponding decline had taken place in the sum of diseases, there remained quite as many medical practitioners as were wanted, until mankind gradually arrived at their present state of enlightenment with respect to physiology, and at length diseases and doctors became extinct together. Chapter 5. Labor 5th. How Hercules cleansed the Augean stables of England. Oxford Street has its Pantheon, Regent Street its Circus, and a clubhouse in Pall Mall is called the Athenaeum. In addition to these classicalities of London, there were formerly the Augean stables. The original Augean stables were tenements appertaining to one Auges, king of Elis, a country of Peloponnesus. They had been occupied for many years by about 3,000 head of livestock, consisting of goats and oxen, and during all that time had never once been cleaned out, so that, although externally they bore the appearance of stables, their interior arrangements were rather like those of a pigsty, and one of a particularly bad style. Perhaps, however, as there were no pigs in them, we had better say that they were a sort of ill-regulated cow-houses, but whether pigsties, cow-houses, or stables, they were extremely insalubrious and unpleasant, and ought to have been indicted for a nuisance. Hercules, during his mortal career, performed the astonishing feat of cleansing and dulcifying these odoriferous outhouses in one day, which masterpiece of scavengery he accomplished by the simple process of turning the course of the river Alpheus through them. Divested, by this means, of their delicate superfluities, they were fit, with a little clean straw, for the accommodation of a race. Which masterpiece of scavengery he accomplished by the simple process of turning the course of the river Alpheus through them. Divested, by this means, of their delicate superfluities, they were fit, with a little clean straw, for the accommodation of a racing stud. Though perhaps they would first have required a little rose water. The English Augean stables, which were in existence so lately as the year 1843, were situated in various parts of London. Some were called offices, others, courts, but the principal were denominated houses. These last stood on the Middlesex side of the Thames contiguous to Westminster Bridge. Their outside was really very like that of common stables, the reason of which was, that they had been built up in a great hurry for temporary use. The old buildings having been recently burnt down. Though what may seem singular, that accident had not in the slightest degree ameliorated the state of the interior from which they had derived their appellation. But the filth in them was moral filth, which is incombustible by material fire. The whooping, shouting, yelling, hooting, groaning and other uncouth and zoological noises which were occasionally made in these stables, might have induced the hearer, if out of sight of what was going on within, to suppose that they were really what they seemed to be. At least that they were mews, or pens, or menageries, where wild beasts and other animals were confined. Among these sounds there was a very common one which much resembled braying, nor when, upon being more distinctly listened to, it was found to be articulate, did the similitude disappear. However, the occupants of these edifices were really human beings, though not a few, in the qualities of their intellect, partook strongly of the asinine nature, and it was remarked in a celebrated newspaper of the day, that any allusion made to the thistle-munching quadrupeds of the long ears was certain to excite a sort of sympathetic cachinnation in the assembly held therein. Several, from their connection with agriculture, and also from their tastes, habits, and ideas, might figuratively have been termed oxen. But the only bulls in the Augean stables were Irish, or oral bulls, and these were tolerably numerous. Goats, there were none, unless the representative of a Welshman may be called a goat, but of monkeys and puppies of the biped class. Particularly in that division of the stables which was entitled the upper house, there was a considerable number. The tenants of the Augean stables did not live in them always, they only came there on certain evenings from about January or February until August. The purpose for which they met was that of law-making, but they made many more speeches than laws. The object of their legislation was professedly the greatest possible happiness of the public at large, but it was really the greatest possible happiness of the individual legislators. When, in early times, they made laws with ropes about their necks, they enacted whatever pleased the tyrant for the time being, thus judiciously saving their own bacon and laterally. When they began to be subject to pressure from without, they consulted the public good just as far as they were obliged, and no further, allowing justice and benevolence to be squeezed out of them by installments, to an amount exactly proportioned to that pressure. They were divided into two principal classes, who fared theoretically about matters of government, but were cordially united on the principle of taking care of themselves. There was a third and small party whose aim was to promote the national welfare, but those who composed it were scouted. It will now be seen that the legislation in the Augean stables was very dirty work, and, the place not having been cleaned out since its foundation several centuries back, though an abortive attempt with that view was made in 1830, that the accumulation of filth there must have been prodigious. This chiefly consisted of foul and sordid acts, which, therefore, instead of being wholesome and salutary, as such acts ought to have been, were grievously the reverse, to the infinite scandal and offense of all rightly constituted noses. The other places which were likewise denominated Augean stables, were also in a very disgraceful state. The various courts were defiled with injustice, and one in particular, yclept the Court of Chancery, was so overladen with rascality that it was called in bitter irony the Court of Equity. Of the offices, those termed police offices were full of partiality and oppression, and those which belonged to the government, besides swarming with a sort of locusts, caterpillars, and other vermin, who preyed on the vitals of the country, were replete with fraud and humbug. Such were the delightful dens, which Hercules, by way of parallel to his former achievement, found it his vocation to clean out. Of course it will be supposed, that as of yore he turned the river Alpheus through the stables of his Majesty Augeas. So did he divert the Thames through those of the British sovereign. It is not certain that he had not at first some idea of so doing, the principal stables being commodiously situated for this purpose, and the creatures within them as richly deserving a drenching as did the cattle and creeping things, which did not go up into Noah's ark. But there were two objections to this plan. First, that a great many of the said creatures were, if there be any truth in a certain proverb, exempt from a watery death, and secondly, that to direct that stream through all the stables, some of which lay dispersedly, was physically impossible. But there was another stream which was capable of swamping them all, and he availed himself of it, as we shall see. This stream was the tide of public opinion. How to raise it was the difficulty, though it is easier to raise the water than to raise the wind. But heroes make no bones of difficulties, and break a great many in spite of them. And never more potent was enchanter's wand in arousing the strength of the billows, than the club of Hercules. Prospero's was a rattan to it. In faith he flourished it to some purpose, but first he therewith hoisted out of the sluggish and stagnant waters of the popular mind all those weeds of prejudice, ignorance, gullibility, lability, and selfishness, which had till then kept it a dull-toed pond. And when he had done this, it was a grand sight to see how, first swaying to and fro like an awakened ocean, it gradually rose and swelled, and heaved up its waves unto the sky. For he had stirred it up from the very bottom, whence burst and bubbled up fresh and pure springs innumerable, insomuch that it became a vast world of waters. And now Hercules smote it with his club, as whilom Neptune, when he had a mind to brew up a storm, was wont to smite the main with his trident. Whereat, it roared and foamed terrifically, and broke with tremendous force against the black rocks of interest, bribery, and corruption, which were set up to dam it out from the stables. The rocks shook and trembled to their foundations by reason of its violence, and from behind them arose shouts of rage, and unmeaning menaces, and imprecations, and cries of alarm, amid all which a noise as of many donkeys was distinctly audible. Bit by bit, large masses of rock crumbled and fell with an astonishing sound into the gulf beneath, wherefrom a voice of great triumph, as the voice of many thunders, ascended, rending the air. Nor did the flood, it being now pure, replace with muddy depositions the havoc which it continually made. At last, it having attained to its full height and power, and the rocks having been thoroughly sapped and undermined, Hercules, standing on the shore, did, with one end of his all-potent and magnetic club, attract the huge body of waves unto himself, and then, presenting unto it the other, he repelled and dismissed it, full flow, with irresistible momentum against its barriers, which it burst, broke down, and bore away in its overwhelming tide, and then rushing with unchecked course through those sinks of stables, washed off at one sweep the accumulated abominations of ages. And so Hercules cleaned out the Augean stables.